Who is this country's best-selling novelist? No one knows for sure. The figures are too complicated. Hardback books, paperbacks, and just plain exaggeration. But if you had to give an answer on 5 fingers, be sure one of those fingers counts this man. His name is Louis L'Amour, and you measure L'Amour books not by the copy, but by the ton. For his readers, 6 months without a new L'Amour novel is like a year without sunshine. And Louis L'Amour's success, it is fair to say, is due to the fact that he writes only about what he knows best, which is the way the West was won, as Morley Safer found out.
This is where the great American morality play is performed. It is a part of America that everyone, friends and enemies, understand, even admire. It is the setting for our folklore and our literature. It's even been said that we make foreign policy, as if there was still a West out there to be won. It is, of course, a film set of the Old West. And when we watch a Western movie or television show or read a book, we expect certain things from it, vital ingredients without which we are left dissatisfied. The saloon, for example, this place where good and evil meet to drink, and always close at hand, the dancing girl, the fancy lady with a heart of gold. And the street itself, this avenue of dusty death, on which at opposing ends, good and evil face each other, and the fate of both rests in the quickness of a draw. And on this street, too, the law-abiding citizenry, good people all, having moved west seeking land and freedom, terror always comes in the form of a ruffian gang of brute killers who like nothing better than to ride in and shoot up a peaceful town. And by this door, the sheriff or the marshal sits, a man of strength and silence, a man with an unspoken past who has killed too often. And before the play is over, he knows he must kill again. And over in the hills beyond, the wagon trains move westward ho, making their endless circle, fighting off an endless band of Indians, who with time have changed from ruthless heathen into noble savage. Well, what's it all about? Is that the way it was? Is the play a play of fact, or is it a Hollywood fantasy? Here's a man who knows.
His name is Louis L'Amour. He's spent a lifetime separating fact from fancy. He is America's most prolific Western writer. Other Western writers like Zane Grey, who was a New York dentist, may be better known. But no Western writer has sold more books than Louis L'Amour.
Well, in the first place, let's get back to one thing. The movies have entirely over-dramatized the gunfighter in every sense of the word. The gunfighter was here. He was a natural product of the times, but there were very few men who were known as gunfighters who wanted to be gunfighters. They became so largely by accident. They were men who simply had natural skill with guns, and by the time they'd won 2 or 3 fights, they had the reputation as gunfighters, whether they wanted it or not. And most of them didn't want it. There was always some cheap punks you hear about in the movies, and there were a few of them, very few, who went around looking for reputation. But they didn't last long, because the kind of reputation you find there is written on a tombstone. But the gunfighter is completely overemphasized in the West. There was so much else going on. And actually, usually, all that sort of thing took place on the wrong side of the tracks, you might say, on the wrong side of the street. And many of the people in the West never came in contact with it at all.
It was a sort of inner city problem.
That's right. That's right, exactly that. And the prostitutes and the gambling and all that sort of thing went on in one area of the town, the red light district, which actually came from the railroad men hanging their red lanterns in the front of the houses when they went in. But the gunfighting usually took place over there, you know, and not in the better section of town at all.
To his readers, L'Amour is perhaps this country's best-known novelist. To book reviewers and the literary establishment, perhaps the least known. And yet, there are nearly 65 million copies of his books in print. He's among the most popular writers this country has ever produced. He's written 66 novels, 400 short stories, and at least 30 of his stories have become movies. Movies like Hondo, Shalako, and Heller in Pink Tights.
As a novelist, as a literary man, does it not bother you to not see your books reviewed?
Well, they are reviewed. I would like to have them more importantly reviewed than they are. But we have a very queer situation in this country that anything Western is sort of relegated to ash heap. It's just considered not to be good. Why this is, I don't know, because for example, they think it's more important to detail the experiences of somebody in bed, some couple in bed, rather than the opening of half a continent. It's beyond belief, you know, but it's so.
Lamour is not your tweedy, pipe-smoking, couple of hundred words a day kind of writer. He's a man of action, who quickly gets rid of writer's block by punching it out of himself on the heavy bag. And Lamour is never very far from his roots, from the source of all his wealth and spirit. He takes his summers off and returns with his wife and children to his own spread near Durango, Colorado. He's lived the life of a Jack London, soldier of fortune, lumberjack, longshoreman, professional prizefighter, old China hand, and cowboy. He barely got to high school before he dropped out. He's made a profession of a private passion, the Old West. And you can still see it much the same as it looked when the railways first spanned this country 100 years ago. Lamour is a 10th-generation American with deep roots in the expansion of this country. His great-grandfather fought with the army against the Indians and was scalped for his sins. His grandfather fought off Indians while settling a homestead in North Dakota where Louis was born. When he was very young, he got to meet some old gunfighters who lit the spark that has made Louis L'Amour a rich and learned man today. His plots may be fiction, but the details therein are fact. And Louis L'Amour has become our professor emeritus of how the West was won.
One of the myths I always like to get away from is the idea that a gunfighter or a group of gunfighters could come in and terrorize a Western town. It just couldn't happen. Because you see, nearly everybody in that town grew up using a gun. They were familiar with it. But the thing was that in every town, I would venture to say that 2/3 of the adult men had fought in the Civil War. Well, these men were used to guns. Nobody was going to scare them. No tin horn was going to come along with a gun and buffalo them at all. So you can see what happened at Northfield, Minnesota when the Jesse James and Cole Younger gang tried to rob 2 banks there. They got shot to pieces by a bunch of farmers and businessmen. And the same thing happened in Coffeyville, Kansas with the Dalton gang. They got wiped out. The one man who survived had 16 buckshot in him. He lived for a long time, it sounded. He became a real estate man.
What about the fast draw? Is that an invention of novelists and filmmakers, or did they really pride themselves on that?
It was very important because if 2 men got in a gun battle, it was important who got off the first shot. But I have talked to at least 30 of the old gunfighters and outlaws, and they all said the same thing. The first one who told me was Bill Tillman, who taught me how to use a pistol. He said the fast draw is important, but the most important thing is making the first shot count. You may never get another one. And many a man who drew very fast put his first bullet in the dust right out in front of him, and he never got off another one.
What about the high noon confrontation? 2 men standing in the main street of town drawing against each other. True or false?
It happened occasionally, but only occasionally. Usually it was a point-blank thing right at the moment. Sometimes one man wouldn't be armed. The other fellow said, go get a gun, go heal yourself and come back. And of course when he did, then it was open season. I mean, they took a shot at him whenever they saw him. Another thing I like to get away from is the idea that when a man gets shot, he drops. Some people have the idea that a shot always kills a man and knocks him. It isn't true at all. You take a really tough man, he keeps right on coming. And Colonel Butcher, who made quite a study of gunshot injuries a number of years ago, he decided, after studying him very carefully, that unless a man was shot right through the brain, right through the heart, or was hit on the big bone, he wasn't going to go down, and he was going to keep coming if he was mad. I mean, if he had the adrenaline pumped up in his system.
What about the Western Saloon, the dancing girl with a heart of gold?
Well, there were some of those around. There's no question about that. But they're very rarely as attractive as they are in the movies, and they weren't dressed the way they were in the movies. They usually wore long dresses clear down to their ankles. And there weren't many women in saloons. Now, the Long Branch Saloon is famous from the TV series, you know. Actually, there's no woman in it at all. It was operated by men for men, and only men.
Well, our perception of the West is that, with the exception of the noble sheriff or marshal, was that it was a lawless place. Was that true?
This isn't true. There really was a lot of justice. And a lot of very forthright thinking, however. They had very little patience. They didn't want justice delayed. They wanted it now. They didn't want long trials. Many of the lynchings, so-called, of rustlers out in the West happened because some fellow would catch a man stealing his cattle. He'd hang him right on the spot if there was a tree handy, because it was easier than taking him 100 miles into the courthouse and jail, leaving him there, riding back home, riding in 100 miles more to testify, riding back again, leaving his business, leaving all of his work. It was much simpler to hang him on the spot.
Was murder, and we got the idea that it wasn't, but was murder a serious crime?
Murder was a very serious crime, definitely. You see, when two men shot it out with guns, that was not considered murder. It wasn't considered murder when Burr and Hamilton fought back east either, which was not too long before, you know. So you've got to think with perspective. And Thomas Hart Benton, for example, was a senator, killed 5 men in duels. Andrew Jackson killed 1 and was involved in over 102 as a second or something. Dueling was a way of settling disputes. It was considered the honorable way. Now, contrary to what you see in the Western movies, there were very few fistfights. There were Irishmen out there, some Irish track workers and whatnot, and they fought with their fists. But by and large, the Western men did not.
Our own perception of ourselves, of the white man settling the West, has changed over the years, and now history writers tell us we were full of duplicity and murder, even genocide, as far as the Indians are concerned.
It's not true. It happened. There were cases of murder, there were cases of brutality, there were cases of unnecessary killing, but on both sides. The white man supposedly should have been better, should have been a better person about it. But there was wrong on both sides. And there's no way you can draw the line and say this is all bad. Now, we talk about the treaties. Some of them were lived up to, some of them were not. Some of the Indians broke as many as the white man did. This is not... a lot of people don't like to believe this now. They want to put all the blame on the white man, but it wasn't true. And in many cases, what the white man paid the Indian for his land, he was well paid in the coin of the time, not today. Of course, they tell the famous story about the Indian selling Manhattan Island for $24. He didn't even own it. It was the first crooked real estate deal in America that I know of. The Indian came down out of the hills to go fishing down there. And he didn't even belong in Manhattan Island, in that area. And a fellow asked him if he'd sell him his right to it for this stuff. He said, sure. Why not? So he sold it, got his fish, and went back home. But those stories you don't always get. But the Indian was a fine warrior, in many cases had great wisdom. He had a culture that was perfect for himself and was changing. All the Indian needed at that time was a Genghis Khan. Somebody to come along and weld them into one big group. And we've never made it, believe me. They were great fighting men.
These days, Lamour is something of a Hollywood cowboy, living in some luxury in a Spanish-style villa in Beverly Hills, surrounded by thousands of volumes of books and diaries and maps and explorers' notebooks of the Old West. It's the house that paperbacks built, paperbacks by the scores of millions, in German and French and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian and Serbo-Croatian and, coming soon, Chinese. He still writes 3 novels a year, gets the beginning, middle, and end in his head before he sits down to a typewriter. And as is the way with such things, Louis L'Amour, after 20 years of success and in his 68th year, is just being discovered. He's becoming a star turn at book fairs and the noble primitive of literary luncheons. But here is where he comes to recharge himself, to gather himself together, to see America again as one of Louis L'Amour's own strong, silent men might have seen it 100 years ago.
Out here over this country, there were 1,000 little Alamos, people who fought and died out there to maintain their homes, to keep themselves, and they were bigger than life because the times demanded it. Right now, our times don't, but I'm firmly convinced that it's all still here. The feeling is here, everything. People say they're greed, they say it's a materialistic society. Society has always been materialistic. Show me a country or a time that wasn't materialistic.
Do you think Louis L'Amour was born 100 years too late?
No, I'd rather be born in this time than any other time. This is an exciting period. Stop and think what's happened in this period. We've put a man on the moon. This is the most dramatic thing since the world began. People are kind of taking it for granted, but they shouldn't. It's a tremendous thing. This is the first step into a new frontier. because we're moving out there where it's all going to happen in the future. And I'm not downbeat about the country at all. I'm very, very optimistic about the whole thing, and there's no reason why not. If you permit me to say so, and you've looked at my library here, I have at my fingertips 6,000 years of man's history. And there have always been times when things were bad. There have always been periods of terrible crime. There's always been periods of hardship. But this is the best time that man ever had on the face of this earth, right now. The best time in which to live.